listen-only mode.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Ann Wong with the Illinois Chapter American Academy of Pediatrics, and I thank you for joining us for today's webinar on immunizations using social media for outreach. Today, we are joined by Dr. Nusheen Aminuddin from the Mayo Clinic. Before we get started, I would just like to go over a few housekeeping items. This is our webinar planning group, and nobody on the planning group, the presenter, content reviewers, and or the CME application reviewers had any disclosures. This is the CME accreditation statement. This just lets everybody know that physicians and nurses will be receiving 1 hour of credit, and that funding was provided by the Chicago Department of Public Health. So next, I just want everyone to know that participant phone lines are muted. This webinar is being recorded, and everyone will receive a PDF copy of the PowerPoint slides, a link to complete the evaluation, and a link to the recording of the webinar by the end of business day. If you have any questions for Dr. Aminuddin during the presentation, please enter them into the question box on your control panel for the webinar located on the right-hand side of your screen. Your questions will be answered at the end of the presentation. So I would now like to introduce Dr. Aminuddin. Dr. Aminuddin is a pediatrician at the Mayo Clinic, where she is also an assistant professor of pediatrics. She recently finished up a fellowship in minority health policy at Harvard Medical School. She will be moving up to serve as chair of the AAP Council on Communications and Media next week, and she also serves on the board of directors of the Minnesota chapter of the AAP. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Aminuddin.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much, Anne. Thank you for this opportunity to talk about two of my favorite issues, immunizations and social media. And thank you also for providing all of this wonderful technical assistance, because believe it or not, I am actually technically inept. So thanks everyone for joining us. Why don't we advance the slide, please? As Anne mentioned earlier, I have no financial relationships to disclose, and I will not be discussing any off-label use. I always give a disclaimer that I was actually one of those reluctant social media users once upon a time. So if I do have skeptics on the call, I understand you and I appreciate your position. But I'm hoping that after this webinar, you'll also understand why your voice is important and how you can engage online, especially with regard to immunization advocacy. My Twitter handle is at NAMD4kids, and feel free to live tweet if that's your thing. Next slide, please. And then also, because I actually work for a professional organization, it's important for me to mention that some of the examples of advocacy I use here may not necessarily represent the official positions of my employer or even the American Academy of Pediatrics. So hopefully everyone is pro-vaccine. So thank you for that. Next slide, please. For the most part, this is going to be a very basic introduction to social media. So for those of you who have never ventured into the world of social media, we'll talk a little bit about how to get started, and I will share some resources that you can access after the fact. And I always tell people, if you are in an organization where you have residents or students or just anyone who's tech savvy, they're always a great resource. So please feel free to go to them too if you're interested in getting started. We'll also be talking about how you can connect with other pediatricians and really ultimately effectively implement social media as a communication tool. And finally, we'll talk a little bit about resources and strategies to use social media during, unfortunately, outbreaks of measles and for other issues that will no doubt come up. Next slide, please. So I wanted to start again with just some basics about social media. Number one, I think it is actually important to talk about some of the rules of social media engagement. Some things are intuitive, I feel, but others are things that you might not know about until you've spent a little bit of time in the social media space and learned a few things. The good news is you don't have to reinvent the wheel. There are now a lot of institutions that have social media policies, and we'll go over a couple of important highlights there. And again, number two, we'll talk about connecting with others online. And finally, we'll talk about immunization advocacy to hopefully give you the most useful application of your time. Next slide, please. So number one, the rules of engagement. Step one. Next slide, please. I always go back to this particular tweet. This is from Susan Martin, who some of you might know is one of the AAP Public Affairs staff at the headquarters in Itasca. I really think that her tweet, as shared by Dr. Claire McCarthy, who is one of the early pediatricians from Boston Children's Hospital and Harvard Medical School, is a nice way to kind of view your engagement with social media. It is basically like a sandbox, and I think the number one rule is just play nicely with other people, whether they're kids or they're adults on social media. So I think if you kind of go in with that attitude, it will help stave off a number of issues. But we will talk a little bit about how to deal with people who don't play so nicely in the sandbox, particularly when it comes to dealing with anti-vaxxers online. But in general, I think this is just a good way to approach social media. Next slide, please. I also really like Dr. Faris Tamimi's 3-line social media rules. And again, some of this just seems intuitive, but things can sometimes get magnified online, and so I think it's all the more important to remember that credibility matters and integrity matters. I really like the fact that he just boiled everything down to this statement: don't lie, don't pry, don't cheat, can't delete, don't steal, and don't reveal. And he's the medical director for Mayo Clinic Center for Social Media, which, by the way, is one of the reasons that I first created a Twitter account. I had thought that my fairly traditional organization wouldn't necessarily be pushing into the world of social media, but as innovation is important, Mayo Clinic created this Center for Social Media, I want to say almost a decade ago, and have encouraged employees to get online. So those of you who work for large organizations or even small organizations, if you are worried that they might push back, you might actually be surprised about that. So the first thing is know your organization's rules. If you don't find a social media set of rules or guidelines initially, I would recommend talking to the people in your public affairs department to find out what their rules are for engagement online. For example, with Mayo Clinic, they actually encouraged us to create social media accounts to identify ourselves, openly, truthfully, transparently, but to also make it very clear that when we post things online, regardless of what it's about, we are not representing the institution's official position. So when you create an account, you might need to add a disclaimer of some kind. Either opinions or tweets are my own, they don't reflect my institution's position, or something like that. And again, you can probably talk with your institution to get the language that they will find most acceptable. The one caveat, though, is that even if you have a disclaimer, it really doesn't absolve or protect you from ethical breaches or legal violations. You can't share patient information, especially identifiable patient information online, any more than you can in face-to-face contact. Plagiarism is also not good. I was unfortunately on the receiving end of plagiarism through a fellow pediatrician who I happened to connect with on Twitter. But I will also say that social media adds a level of transparency and accountability, which is actually how I found out that I had been plagiarized. So social media, for whatever pitfalls you are imagining in your head, can also be really wonderful in many other ways. And inflammatory speech. Unfortunately, we live in a time where politics is very polarized. And remember that you do have a responsibility as a physician, as a professional, to conduct yourself professionally in whatever space you're in. So again, even if you have all of the appropriate disclaimers, keep in mind that that might not protect you from essentially bad behavior. Next slide, please. So this is a fairly busy slide, but I put it in mostly to let you all know that, again, you don't have to reinvent the wheel. If you are interested in creating a social media policy, and I really feel strongly that physicians should have a hand in helping to create their institution's social media policy, you can certainly go to the Mayo Clinic Social Media Network, accessible to everyone online, to look at some of these ideas. And I think of all of these things, I would just highlight a few things. Like, number one, follow whatever your institution's rules are. Make sure you're not presenting yourself as someone who's officially representing your organization. Always be respectful. Make sure it doesn't interfere with your work commitments. That can also be an issue. And I think number 7 on the right side is also important. Mayo Clinic feels pretty strongly about not friending patients on social media unless you have like a pre-existing social relationship with them. And the way that Dr. Hamimi, who created that brief social media rules in a nutshell, actually puts it nicely. Like, if this is someone who you'd invite over for dinner to your home, who you'd consider a friend in that respect, then it's probably okay to connect with them online. But I also think it's important just to look at each case individually. So again, you can certainly go back to that later if you want to look it over more thoroughly. Next slide, please. I think when you look at avoiding social media or hashtag Sony pitfalls, again, a lot of this is intuitive, some of it's basic common sense, but it does help, I think, to have just a few rules or a few ways to sort of train yourself to think. And I don't actually know who to credit for this, but I've seen it in a couple of different places. Think twice, tweet once, which I think is just good advice in general, whether you're talking or tweeting or posting somewhere else. Always think carefully about whether or not you really want something out there. Another question is, would you post this on a public billboard for your company? If your boss were looking over your shoulder, would you post it? And a big one, I think, for us, especially with public profiles, whether they're Twitter or Facebook profiles, how would you feel if a patient or a parent saw this? Would they feel like you were being demeaning or derogatory, even if you're joking about some aspect of your work? But I think that that's really key, and that's important for both professionalism, integrity, and also credibility. And then again, getting back to the plagiarism issue, please give credit where credit is due. People say lots of funny and insightful things on Twitter, and that's why we're lucky to have the retweet button. Occasionally people can have same ideas at once. That happens all the time. But again, if you're using someone else's information or their chart or graphic or photograph, I think it's always important to credit as much as possible. And if you don't know who the original creator was, at least say so. Next slide, please. So I remember when I was in residency, and we talked about professionalism, and fortunately that was before Twitter was invented. I'm pretty sure Facebook didn't exist at that time. I was part of the generation that had to learn social media later on in life, and I'm very much not a digital native, like many of the people who are coming up now in medical school, who again are great resources if you need some help with this. But when I went through orientation for residency, and that's also, I think, germane to the time of year that we're in right now, we were told in no uncertain terms that we represent our organization, whether we are wearing our Mayo badges or not, whether we are in scrubs or not. We were told that when we were out in the community doing groceries, doing whatever, people would recognize us because Rochester is a small enough place that we're reasonably recognizable, and that we represent our organization by our actions and by our words. And now, of course, that extends to social media posts. So again, I would say, for all of us as individuals, but also as people who represent our organizations, and even more than that, represent a profession where we are trusted with people's lives, really, we just have to remember to uphold that standard. And again, social media creates a level of transparency that is unlike anything we have experienced before, which can be good and bad. It does lead to increased accountability. So just remember that. And even if you have a moment where you put something out and you later regret it and you delete it, the internet is forever. People can take screenshots of things. So again, just kind of have that mindset of play nicely in the sandbox, as well as the fact that we are physicians and we are professionals 24/7. Next slide, please. So I feel like at this point, I always feel like I've scared people. And you might be wondering why I'm logging off this webinar right now. This is not for me. I have enough to deal with in my day-to-day life with EMRs and anti-vaxxers. So why on earth would we do this as physicians in our already busy days? Next slide, please. Because unfortunately, inaction also has consequences. And this is an article from Wired from a few years ago. The background for this is that at the time, the state of California the legislature was looking at a bill that would eliminate non-medical exemptions for vaccines. And what was interesting is that it also exposed the fact that the anti-vaccine movement online is very well coordinated. There have unfortunately also been pediatricians who put out very innocent and professionally appropriate recommendations to vaccinate. Some have had a little bit of fun with it. They put out videos of their office talking about why they vaccinate. Others have just had simple posts saying, hey, it's flu vaccine time, come into the office. But what actually happened with this bill that was sitting in the California legislature was that the anti-vaxxers organized, and people from around the world, like literally people from Australia even, who were part of this very vocal movement, gave the impression that the majority opinion was against the bill that would have passed. But when they actually drilled down, they found out that of the 250,000 tweets with the hashtag CDC whistleblower, those are the anti-vax tweets that went out between this period of time, over 63,000 of them came from just 10 accounts. And I think that's pretty significant. And I always tell people, like, I have tweeted a lot. Even I couldn't tweet that much, or typically wouldn't tweet that much. But when I think about the American Academy of Pediatrics nationwide, we have some 67,000 pediatrician members. If every member of the American Academy of Pediatrics sent out one tweet during that time, we would have easily washed out the influence of these anti-vax tweets. And so that's why I also think it's important for us to have a voice, to be online, and to be active, or at least to be in a position where we can take action when needed. Next slide, please. And also around that time, some of you may know Dr. Jamie Friedman. She was also one of, I think, the early social media leaders. She was actually the person with this tweet, full-time primary care pediatrician in San Diego, who was actually identified as the person by the Department of Health who essentially first gave notice of this measles outbreak in Disneyland, which was 4 years ago now, and I feel like history is repeating itself, unfortunately. But she's actually one of the reasons why I decided to get involved online. And as a result of this measles outbreak, because I realized if we as pediatricians are not out there putting out good information, we are ceding our voices to the anti-vaxxers. So anyhow, that was a real coup for pediatricians, and Dr. Friedman's also a great follow on Twitter. Next slide, please. So now moving into step 2, how do you connect with others? How do you connect with great people like Dr. Friedman and other pediatricians? Next slide, please. First of all, I just wanted to give you an idea of what the social media landscape is like, and that graphic is from a couple years ago, so I promise you it's expanded even more since then. It can sometimes feel a little bit overwhelming, especially if you are an introvert like myself, who at least prior to social media was fairly reserved, I would say. I was not one of those people who really wanted to share personal information or even put myself out there. The idea of self-promotion, which seems inherent in social media, also just didn't sit right with me. But it actually took the Disneyland measles outbreak and, unfortunately, a hate crime against 3 young American Muslims in Chapel Hill, North Carolina, which was around the same time, that finally sort of made it click in my mind that that if we don't own the narrative, someone else is going to fill that void for us, and they might not fill it with accurate information. And unfortunately, there can be some fairly serious consequences as a result. So yes, those of you who are reluctant, I look at this and I think, oh boy, yeah. The other takeaway I would say is that even though there's so much out there, you don't have to feel obligated to join every platform. I even now don't have a Facebook account. I created an Instagram account as more of just a fun side thing, but I barely ever use it. So really, Twitter is what I focus on. And I would also say, as a caveat, social media platforms evolve. Like once upon a time, MySpace was the predominant thing for young people, and now that's a ghost. And then Facebook even seems to be losing a little bit of its luster, though that is still the social media platform with the most people on it. So again, I know it can be overwhelming, but you can pick one thing, sort of learn about it, and then decide later on if you want to create other social media accounts. Next slide, please. I also just wanted to say a little bit about traditional media versus social media, and I wanted to call your attention to that tweet in the upper right. That is from Dr. Karen Remley, who's the immediate past CEO of the American Academy of Pediatrics. I always come back to her statement about be first, be right, and be credible as another sort of overarching social media goal. And for those of you who don't know, Dr. Remley actually came to the AP after serving a few different positions. I believe she was connected with the CDC, but she also served as the state health commissioner for the state of Virginia. And so all the more important, when you're in positions like that, to really make sure that you have that credibility. And so I always like the way that she sort of encapsulated that in be first, be right, be credible. And so when you look at social media, a few things set it apart from traditional media. Number one, it's much faster. Things happen minute to minute, not, day to day. Once upon a time, for those of us who are old enough to remember, you would sit down and watch the evening news, and that was kind of the news cycle. But now, boy, if you're not connected and you don't hear breaking news, if you respond to it even a few hours later, it's probably already old news. There's no gatekeeper to social media, which is both good and bad. You used to have news organizations, editors, producers who would determine what was newsworthy and what wasn't. But, anything can be put out there on social media. And again, for better or for worse, misinformation can really flourish there because it's completely unfiltered. But on the positive side, it's a great way to organize grassroots efforts to raise issues that have not made mainstream news and to elevate the issues of marginalized voices. So I've learned a lot from being on Twitter just by following people whose life experiences are different from my own. And of course, also kind of paying attention to what's happening in the vaccine world, both from pro-vaccine, reliable, credible sources and those that are not so credible. The other thing about social media is you can contribute to it, whereas with traditional media, it was unidirectional and you're basically consuming it. And also social media provides a great way to amplify voices, amplify issues, particularly as it relates to vaccine advocacy. Next slide, please. So again, if you're looking at tentatively taking some of the first steps to getting involved on social media, number one, first choose a platform. I find Twitter is a great platform. For me, that has been the best way to connect with other pediatricians. I also think that it works well for busy pediatricians who don't have time to create long posts or create a blog. And I know a number of people who sort of started on Twitter and it's been a little bit of a gateway drug for them. So be aware of that too. You might enjoy it so much that you decide to branch out into other areas. I will say for vaccine advocacy, you've got to think about your audience and your message. If you really want to reach parents, Facebook is where parents are. A number of pediatricians I know have those Twitter accounts and professional Facebook pages separate from the personal pages where they post vacation pictures and connect with friends from high school. But keep that in mind. If you really want to reach parents, Facebook is probably where you want to be. That is also, unfortunately, where a lot of the most rabid and active anti-vaxxers are. We certainly have them on Twitter, but I feel it at a much lower degree. So again, just think about that. For me, it was all about connecting with my colleagues and sharing information about vaccines that I could then bring back to my patients, to my community, and share online. So Twitter worked really well for me, and I still don't want to be on Facebook. And as mentioned earlier, don't overwhelm yourself. It's okay to have a slow start. I sort of unofficially mentor a number of people on Twitter, which I think is a lot of fun and still seems strange to me given the fact that I've only been on Twitter for 5 years, and really about 8 months of that first year, I didn't tweet like almost at all. I had a dormant account for nearly a year until the Disneyland measles outbreak and the other incident in Chapel Hill. So when I mentor people, they're like, oh, I put out this tweet about great information that no one seems to have retweeted it, or only one person liked it, and that's okay. That's just how it's going to be early on. And I know it can be frustrating to feel like you're screaming into the void and no one's listening, but we will talk about ways to connect with others and sort of increase your presence online as well. I found it was really really helpful, to lurk, which is basically like listening, watching, and then slowly taking steps to engage, eventually sharing content and producing content. Next slide, please. And I just wanted to point you to a couple of resources, and of course you'll get the PDF of this file. I wrote an article about getting started on Twitter a couple of years ago in the AP News, and so you're welcome to check that. What's I think good about the article is it actually has links at the bottom where you can literally go and find out, this is how I create a Twitter account. These are the steps I have to take. So again, you don't have to reinvent the wheel. And of course, I really strongly recommend taking your resident or your student out to lunch, have them teach you, and it's a win-win for everybody. Next slide, please. So the other thing is, when you start on Twitter, you have to choose a name for yourself, or a handle. And I think a few important points here. Keep it short. Twitter used to be limited to no more than 140 characters. Now they've expanded to 280 characters. But if you want to get your message across and you end up tagging other people or putting their names in, or people want to tag you and put your name in, the longer your handle is, the less space you're going to have. So try to keep your handle short. Identify yourself appropriately, make it relevant. My personal advice is avoid the underscore. A lot of people, a lot of famous people, a lot of very active pediatricians use that underscore, but I have found that when people use that, it's actually much harder to find them online and harder to search. So my advice is just ignore that. Next slide, please. Yeah, for example, my handle is NAMD for kids, and it makes sense after you look at it, because NA are my initials, MD is my medical credential, and 4 kids because I'm a pediatrician. And my name's a little bit long. So I knew that at Dr. Nushin Immunizing was just not going to be feasible, and no one was going to be able to spell it, and that would just make it difficult for people to find me. So NAMD for Kids has worked pretty well, with the notable exception of one of your own Illinois AAP members, Dr. Deanna Behrens, who, by the way, is a good friend of mine, who just always calls me Nam from now on. So sometimes you might get an unwanted nickname as a result of your handle, but it's all good. Next slide, please. And speaking of Dr. Behrens, I wanted to point out that Twitter bios can vary greatly. It's always nice, I think, to identify yourself appropriately. Use your real name. I'm not a fan of creating anonymous accounts for reasons that have to do with professionalism and also just accountability. So I strongly recommend identifying yourself professionally. Totally fine and very appropriate to identify yourself as a physician. Put your degree up there. Always make sure you have those disclaimers, like I can't provide medical advice. And if you look at Dr. Behrens' bio and my own, you can also feel free to share things that are fun, personal, or unique. She happens to like the Oxford comma, also known as the serial comma. I happen to not. And that has been the source of many fake Twitter fights, all in good fun. And I think it's also helpful to consider including a link to your LinkedIn webpage or your professional webpage. That's also a good way to connect with people professionally. Next slide, please. And some basic pediatrician tips. So pediatricians are pediatricians on Twitter, and the AAP actually has a list of pediatricians online, and the social media manager for the AAP actually sends those monthly emails to keep us abreast of what campaigns the AAP is involved in and how we can also get involved, whether it's asking Save Kids about gun, accidental gun violence prevention, or vaccines work, which is a big thing, obviously. So I would just say, like, a couple things. Social media is meant to be social. It's about interacting. It's not a one-sided thing. Hashtags help people connect. So hashtag Put Kids First is a very popular AAP hashtag. When you start using hashtags like Put Kids First or Vaccines Work, or Vaccines Save Lives, that'll show up when people do searches. And so that can actually help you connect to other pediatricians and like-minded people. The caveat is sometimes there will be trolls online. Trolls are people who just want to fight with you, and we'll talk about troll control in a bit. But that's a way to connect with people in general for good reasons, but it can also draw attention to yourself. So we'll talk about how to deal with that if that happens to you. It also helps to use lists to organize your feed. Sometimes if you follow multiple people on Twitter, it can get overwhelming, but there are ways to find a way to filter out the information that's less useful to you. I personally think it's very important to set boundaries, and I have no problem if people are being rude or abusive or harassing in any way. I either mute them or I block them, especially when they're like anti-vax trolls or e-cigarette vaping trolls, who are, by the way, very well funded. So just be aware that you put information out there, you put opinions out there, people can sometimes come at you, but there are ways to handle that. And there's a support network also of other pediatricians. You're not alone out there. And so I hope that if anyone has reservations, they will know that there are other people who can give you advice, who can also help assist you if and when this happens to you in a big or small way, and that there is a great network. And I also think it's useful for just personal health and sanity to take a break from social media now and then. Next slide, please. And I just wanted to mention, I love mentioning this because Dr. Ursula Bernici is one of our residents, and she created her Twitter account as an intern. And as you can see, like, this was one of her, this was early in the course. She at the time had only 27 followers early on. But when we were advocating for protection of the Affordable Care Act and reauthorization of the Children's Health Insurance Program, or CHIP. She was one of the people who got involved, and she used a hashtag. She used a couple hashtags, support CHIP and hashtag CHIP. And despite having only a few followers at that time, this tweet of hers got a lot of engagement. 26 retweets is just fantastic. I mean, even now, you know, I've been at this for a few years. It's exciting to have a tweet go to get that popular. So hashtags can definitely help you out there. Next slide, please. And then, so tagging others. Tagging means that you are putting their handles into your tweet, which then means that in this fire hose of information of Twitter, they won't easily miss your tweet because it'll show up in their notifications. And a couple of years ago, when a colleague and I had written a letter to the editor about refugees in our community, and unfortunately some misinformation that had been shared by another community member, I actually was able to amplify this message by taking a picture and putting it out on Twitter. And also there's a group of pediatricians who I connected with in my very early days of Twitter who all had a strong interest in immigrant and refugee health. And because we all had that interest, we would often tag each other when we came across articles of interest, and also to help amplify messages. So I tagged all of them in that tweet, and they were kind enough to, you know, retweet and share the message. The caveat to the whole tagging thing is I think it's important to tag people judiciously. Be considerate of other people's mentions. There is this ridiculous thread, which means like a stream of tweets, a whole conversation from 2 years ago that includes a number of pediatricians and a number of anti-vaccine accounts that has over 50 recipients on the list. And so literally it's still going. And every time someone who is tagged in that, every time like someone responds to that or they like a tweet, everyone gets a notification. So unfortunately, because of the direction that has taken, I know a number of people have muted the conversation, which means they will no longer get notifications of that. So I always just say, like, if you see something where there are like multiple people and you're liking it to be polite, just remember that means like all 50-some people are getting notifications. So some people love that. Some people really enjoy it. There's like this dopamine button in the brain, it feels like, when people like posts and share posts and tweets, but some people don't. So so keep in mind that is a double-edged sword. It may actually help you connect if, as long as it's not one-sided. You don't want to just be tagging people to get them to promote your stuff. It should be a bi-directional, mutually beneficial thing. And also, if you want to reply, there are ways to untag the 49 other people. So again, more information about that if you actually visit the resources. Next slide, please. So now we'll get to the heart of the matter, what you can do for immunization advocacy online. Next slide, please. I have found that there are probably 3 types of pediatricians specifically who tend to engage online. You have content creators who are the ones who like create blogs, who create original content about immunizations and put it out there. And then there are people who are sharers and amplifiers, which is probably the category I fit into. I share good information from other people, and I help to amplify that by putting it out there and sharing with my network. And then there are the people who very actively engage, the anti-vaxxers, and that can be an interesting space to be in. I generally don't do that myself, but there are exceptions. So next slide, please. If you've been in the social media space for any length of time, you most likely know Dr. Wendy Sue Swanson, also known as Seattle Mama Doc. She was, I believe, the first physician or first pediatrician to have a platform created by a hospital where she created this blog. And literally her most recent blog entry is about the measles outbreak. So she provides very timely information, pro-science information, and has has really done a lot in terms of being able to educate the community, get to mommy bloggers, sorry, I should also say daddy bloggers, parent bloggers, where they are, and ensure that there is good information out there to counteract the misinformation. Next slide, please. And then, of course, there are the sharers and amplifiers, and these include people like your very own Dr. Sadie Laponzi of the Illinois AAP chapter, who I think very effectively was able to connect a personal detail as a pediatrician and the parent of a young infant, sharing this New York Times article that was related to the measles outbreak, and also very appropriately using the hashtag vaccines work to ensure that that connected with a larger audience. I don't normally quote celebrities as sources of good health science, but I actually thought this was wonderful that the actor Dax Shepard tweeted out, "I would have a hard time keeping my opinion to myself if someone was telling me that their 8-month-old did not need a car seat. The same hard time I'm having currently with anti-vaxxers." And so I actually retweeted that. I thought that was really nice of him, and I even replied to him, and there's more to that story, which I'll talk about in a minute. And then there are great resources like our current Surgeon General, Dr. Jerome Adams, who has been unabashedly pro-vaccine and sharing great information using his platform to as he says, loudly proclaim that hashtag vaccines save lives. Next slide, please. So even though I said I don't typically actively engage the anti-vaxxers, although some pediatricians do, some people do it very effectively, my response is usually to ignore, mute, report, or block, depending on their level of vitriol towards me. But again, be aware that if you tweet it, they will come. So to Dax Shepard's previous tweet, I replied saying, thank you, for saying that. So he used hashtag you're not a pediatrician to people who are anti-vaxxers. And so I was like, well, as a pediatrician, thank you for saying that. And of course, someone who is an anti-vaxxer who does not, put their picture up, and I believe last time I checked had 0 followers, he asked, and it's not a gentle question. They're basically accusing me of taking financial kickbacks. And I guess this was just last week, June 20th. At that point, I just felt like responding. But the way I respond generally is to provide a fact. I get 0 financial kickbacks, and in fact, most of us lose money on vaccines. And then I just said goodbye. So I reported the person, blocked them, and I'm done. So that was all there was to it. And again, some people will engage to the point that you get a 2-year-long tweet thread conversation with 50+ people, and that's a choice you're going to have to make. But I don't have time for that. So I feel like as a pediatrician, you can engage at whatever level you feel most comfortable doing that. But sorry, next slide, please. But I think that if you do decide to engage, it's important to keep a couple things in mind. Number one, always take a deep breath. Don't react. Don't react out of frustration or anger, because that's exactly what they're trying to get you to do. Do a little bit of research. Is this someone who actually has influence in the anti-vax community, or is it someone with 0 followers who, it could be a bot, could be someone who's just creating lots of false accounts. Know who you're dealing with. I learned, unfortunately, the hard way when I provided a well-intentioned, answer and article link that unfortunately, this was a few years ago, someone was part of a white supremacist hate network. And oh boy, I wish I had not engaged at all. Had I looked at their page and looked at a few of their tweets, I would have known that and would have known to just, disengage, block, stay away. Whatever you're doing, choose your battles wisely, and always know when to disengage. You always have the option to take yourself out of a conversation. But most importantly, always remain professional. As a physician, you are just going to be held to a higher standard. So keep that in mind. Don't let them throw you off your game. Next slide, please. And I think I just want to speak briefly about this. When it comes to vaccines, a number of us in different places have vaccine bills coming up in the state, and I know that our state chapters do a great job of keeping us apprised of those things. But this is actually a nice way to engage legislators as a pediatrician. And by the way, Dr. Yaspo Fuda engaged her legislator, who happens to be another pediatrician, Dr. Richard Pan, who is also a state senator, talking about a bill that can help limit vaccine preventable diseases. So do that. Next slide, please. And by the way, legislators are listening, and sometimes it's to the loudest voices. I thought this was hilarious. Dr. Lauren Gamble had tweeted her legislator to sort of say, does it make any difference when we use social media? And her legislator, Representative Howard responded, and she said, yeah, absolutely. Sometimes it's the loudest voices really that get attention. So keep that in mind. Knowing that the anti-vaxxers are also quite busy doing their thing, we should also be busy promoting evidence-based science. Next slide, please. And another colleague of mine actually attended a conference last year, and I thought it was fascinating that they found that fewer than 30 social media comments are enough to get the attention of your elected officials. So again, think about, how many pediatricians there are in the state of Illinois. If vaccine bills come up in your state legislature, that's also a good way to connect with your legislators. But always call because calls are verifiable. But again, don't forget the impact of social media. Next slide, please. And here's just a list of some Twitter immunization resources. The top three are all related to the American Academy of Pediatrics. Of course, you should follow your state chapter, Illinois AAP, and then government sources, Surgeon General, Health and Human Services, CDC. And there's so many pediatricians I could mention, but I would inevitably leave people off. But again, as you sort of get into the space, get your feet wet, you'll find out who to connect with, and you'll find out who tweets more about immunization, who creates content, and you'll be able to connect with them as well. Next slide, please. And then again, just more resources. So when you get the PDF, you can certainly click on any of these. I find the AP is just a fantastic resource, and I'm also going to put on my hat as almost chair of the Council on Communications and Media. A number of our vaccine advocates who are active online are members of COCM, and so recommend that you consider joining us. I'm happy to answer any questions personally. We also have free resident membership. Next slide, please. So really just to wrap up, your voices are powerful. Like, people do invest you with some amount of authority and credibility. I think that is a very precious gift and a privilege. I also think it's a responsibility for us to use effectively to, again, disseminate evidence-based science to combat all the misinformation that's out there. Don't underestimate the impact you can have, and please, don't be shy or scared to engage online. I promise you, I had every fear possible in my head, and some of those things have happened. I've had anti-vax trolls come after me. I've had the Islamophobic trolls come after me, the racist trolls come after me. But you survive it, and you learn how to manage things and make your experience what you want it to be, while still being able to have hopefully a positive impact. So your voice matters, and again, in a void, someone's going to fill it. And if you're not the one putting information out there, it's going to be the anti-vaxxers, and to me, that's just not acceptable. And then on a personal note, social media reflects who you are in real life. So be authentic, be ethical, be nice, follow the rules, be a decent human being. As I say to people, don't be a jerk, don't plagiarize, don't steal, don't share information inappropriately, don't be unpleasant, I guess, in a way that don't be mean. You can be firm, you can set boundaries, and it can be a great opportunity. I've connected professionally with so many people. Like I remember that tweet I showed you of the letter with the refugees. The people who I tagged in that tweet, who again at that time I don't think we even met in person. Literally, the 5 of us met last weekend at a refugee conference in Toronto, and it was the first time we'd all been together in person, and it was just incredible. We actually, a few of us gave a workshop together, so it can be a fantastic way to connect with people professionally and also personally. Next slide, please. And I just want to take a moment to acknowledge everyone who's helped with this. Big thanks to Jenny and Anne, especially Anne, who tolerated my tech in my lack of tech knowledge. So thank you so much, and thanks to Jenny for this opportunity, and everyone at Mayo Clinic, AAP Public Affairs and Federal Affairs, and my fellow pediatricians who taught me so much. Next slide, please. I would be happy to take questions at this time. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you so much, Dr. Amenity. And there was definitely, a lot of information in there that I wasn't really aware of before. So it was really nice to kind of get all of that. So I'm gonna wait for people to put in their questions. And then in the meantime, I'm just gonna do the wrap up of the housekeeping items for everyone. So we have one more upcoming webinar this month, and that is actually going to be tomorrow from 12 to 1 p.m. and it is with Dr. Gary S. Marshall, who will be providing a talk on perspectives on vaccine hesitancy. And if you're not aware, he is the author of the Vaccine Handbook, which is commonly just called the Purple Book. So I think we're all pretty excited for that. It should be a really in-depth conversation that we're hoping to have at the end. And you can register at that link below. And then next steps for everyone. Everyone will be receiving a copy of the PowerPoint slides, a link to complete the evaluation, and a link to the recording of the webinar. And then once you receive that, complete the evaluation by July 8th. That's about 2 weeks from now. And then after that date, we're going to close up the evaluation and you won't be able to fill it out anymore, which means you won't be receiving a certificate of attendance and or continuing education credit. So if you want those things, please be sure to fill it out before July 8th. And then lastly, everyone who fills out the evaluation will receive a certificate by July 2nd. So it looks like we do have one question that's come in so far, and it is, do you put tweets as info or mostly as a response to current affairs?
I'm sorry, I didn't catch that. Do I put out tweets as
information or mostly as a response to current affairs?
Oh, okay, that's a great question. I guess I do a little bit of both. I tend to scan the Twitter timeline, which is, my feed, what the people I follow are putting out there. And so oftentimes, I will share news articles that are relevant to children's health. Measles outbreak, of course, we've been hearing about everywhere. So, I will share that information. I guess you could say that's kind of a response to current events. Sometimes I just put out my own sort of content. I have found that the content I put out has morphed in the last few years. Early on, I think I was very careful and I would, just put out little things like, vaccinate, or here's, what the AAP says about this. And since then, I think as I've gotten more comfortable with being online and comfortable with, what my own boundaries of privacy are, I probably shared a little bit more personal information. So sometimes I'll just create content about what's happening in a given day. I try to, make it interesting for people, but sometimes it's just observations on the world. And, this past year I was doing a fellowship, and so I initially kind of wanted to be quiet about it. I didn't want that to be a big part of my Twitter feed, but I found, some of my colleagues, fellow pediatricians, are like, oh no, I'm sort of living vicariously through your experience going back to school and training again. And so I started to share more of what I was learning from lectures, from professors, from other activities around campus. So I would say it's probably a little bit of both. I hope that answers your question. Anything else?
Okay, so I'm not seeing any other questions come in right now, but if anybody has anything, that comes up after this, we've already ended the webinar for everyone, feel free to reach out to me at my email. I'm sure that you guys all got it from the marketing and stuff, so everybody has that. And also when you get your follow-up email, you'll have Melissa Bustamante, who is the coordinator on immunizations. You'll have her contact information. But I just wanted to thank all of you so much for taking the time out of your schedule to participate in this webinar with us. And I also wanted to thank Dr. Nushin Aminuddin for the excellent presentation. It was definitely something that was really interesting. So, Lori has a question about, can we have access to the webinar like notes? I'm not too sure what you mean by that question, but I'll just be like sharing, the PowerPoint. I mean, not the PowerPoint, but a PDF of the presentation. So hopefully that will help with your information. So thank you again to everyone for attending, and thank you, Dr. Aminuddin.
Well, thank you, Anne. I enjoyed it, and thank you, everyone, for giving up your lunch hour. Hope to meet you either in person or in the virtual world online. Thank you.
Thanks. Have a good afternoon.
Thank you. You too. Bye.